February 14, 1946. Rheinhausen, British occupation zone, Germany. The winter sun hung pale and cold over the ruins of what had once been a munitions factory. Snow fell in thin, exhausted flakes, settling on blackened bricks and twisted steel girders that jutted from the earth like broken ribs. The air smelled of wet ash and diesel fumes from military trucks idling in the distance. Along the perimeter of a converted warehouse, a line of women stood in silence, their breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. They wore coats patched with mismatched fabric, scarves wrapped tight against the wind, shoes held together with wire and string. Their faces were drawn, eyes hollowed by years of rationing, of ersatz coffee made from acorns, of bread stretched thin with sawdust, of children crying from hunger in the night. They had survived the Allied bombs, the collapse of the Reich, the Soviet advance from the east. They had survived, but survival had carved itself into their bones. At precisely 9 in the morning, the doors of the warehouse opened. A British officer, clipboard in hand, motioned them forward. Inside, the air was warmer, heated by industrial stoves that had been requisitioned from a nearby depot. The women shuffled in, eyes adjusting to the light, noses catching the first impossible scent, real coffee. Not the bitter substitute they had choked down for 5 years, but actual roasted beans, brewed strong and hot. Then came another smell, one so foreign it seemed almost hostile in its abundance: bacon. Fried eggs. Fresh bread. Butter. Real butter, yellow and soft, not the grayish margarine that had become a luxury in itself. One woman stopped so abruptly that the person behind her collided into her back. She stood frozen, staring at the long tables arranged in neat rows, at the trays stacked with food, at the American soldiers in clean uniforms ladling portions onto metal plates with the casual indifference of men who had never known hunger. This was a re-education camp dining hall, one of dozens established across the occupied zones of Germany in the months following surrender. The women gathered here were not prisoners in the traditional sense. They were civilians selected for what the Allied command termed democratic rehabilitation. Teachers, nurses, clerical workers, women who had held positions of minor influence under the Nazi regime and were now being prepared to help build a new Germany. But before the lectures on democracy, before the films documenting the concentration camps, before the discussions of collective guilt and national responsibility, there was this, the dining hall. And for many of these women, this room, this overwhelming, incomprehensible abundance of food, would become the first crack in the ideological foundation they had lived upon for 12 years. The United States had entered the occupation with a calculated strategy. Unlike the punitive approach of the Versailles Treaty that had helped birth the resentments exploited by Hitler, the American administration understood that ideology could not be defeated by force alone. General Lucius Clay, the military governor of the American zone, wrote in a confidential report to Washington in October 1945, "We cannot lecture a starving population about the virtues of democracy while they watch their children grow thin. The stomach must be fed before the mind can be opened." This philosophy translated into practical policy. American supply lines, the same vast logistical networks that had landed 2 million tons of supplies on Normandy beaches, now redirected their machinery toward feeding former enemies. Ships that had carried Sherman tanks now carried wheat from Kansas, powdered milk from Wisconsin, canned beef from Texas. The scale was staggering. By early 1946, the United States was shipping over 600,000 tons of food per month into occupied Germany. But the decision to feed the German population, and to feed them well, was not purely humanitarian. It was psychological warfare of a different kind, a campaign waged not with bullets but with bread, not with propaganda posters but with pork chops. The architects of American re-education policy had studied the reports from captured German soldiers, had read the interrogation transcripts, had noted the recurring theme, the shock of American material abundance. Wehrmacht soldiers captured in France had written letters home describing American field kitchens where enlisted men ate better than German officers, where cigarettes and chocolate were distributed so casually they seemed infinite. Luftwaffe pilots shot down over England spoke with bewilderment of British mess halls supplied by American convoys, where food appeared in quantities that defied their understanding of wartime scarcity. The message was unintentional but unmistakable. The enemy possessed resources so vast that generosity itself became a weapon. Now that weapon would be deployed deliberately. The women in Rheinhausen moved slowly through the serving line, each receiving a tray. An American sergeant with a Tennessee drawl spooned scrambled eggs onto their plates, 3 full scoops, enough for a family's weekly ration in 1944. Another soldier added 2 strips of bacon, then a slice of ham. A German-speaking American officer demonstrated how to take bread from the basket, as much as you want. No limit. You can come back for seconds. The words hung in the air like something from a fairy tale. No limit. Several women hesitated, certain this was a test, a trick to identify the greedy or the weak. But the American officer simply smiled and gestured toward the tables. Please sit. Eat. Greta Hoffmann, a 42-year-old schoolteacher from Duisburg, would later describe this moment in a letter to her sister in Hamburg. I sat down with the tray in front of me and I could not move. It was too much. The plate was too full. I thought of the children at home, of how we divided one potato 4 ways, of how we soaked bread crusts in water to make them last. And here was this mountain of food meant only for me, for one meal, for breakfast. I began to cry and I could not stop. Around her, other women wept as well, some silently, some with shoulders shaking. They cried from relief, from shame, from confusion, from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of sitting in a room filled with food after years of systematic deprivation. They cried because the narrative they had been taught, that Germany fought for survival against enemies who sought to starve them, was dissolving with every bite of eggs that tasted richer than anything they had eaten in half a decade. The German experience of scarcity had been carefully constructed by Nazi leadership. From 1939 onward, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had emphasized sacrifice as a patriotic virtue, rationing as a shared burden that united the Volk in their struggle against plutocratic enemies. Posters showed German mothers smiling as they served thin soup, slogans declared, "Wheels must turn for victory," and radio broadcasts praised the ingenuity of housefraus who stretched resources with creativity and discipline. This narrative served a dual purpose. It justified the hardships of war while reinforcing the claim that Germany's enemies, Britain bloated by colonial wealth, America corrupted by capitalist excess, were decadent and morally weak. German soldiers were told they fought for a new order built on discipline and strength, against nations grown soft through abundance. But the soldiers who had actually encountered American forces told different stories. Gunther Mattern, a Wehrmacht corporal captured at the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, later wrote in his memoir, "We expected to meet an army weakened by comfort, soldiers who could not endure hardship. Instead we found men who fought well precisely because they were well fed, well armed, well supplied. They did not fight with the desperation of the hungry. They fought with the confidence of men who knew that behind them stretched an endless supply line, that if a tank was destroyed 10 more would arrive, that if ammunition ran low trucks would bring more before nightfall. This was more frightening than any fanaticism." The women in the Rheinhausen dining hall did not have these battlefield reports. Most had never spoken to a captured soldier, never heard first-hand accounts of the American war machine. Their understanding of the enemy came from newsreels showing bombed German cities, from casualty lists, from the carefully curated narrative of German righteousness under siege. Now they sat in silence, chewing eggs that melted on their tongues, tasting butter that spread smooth and golden across warm bread, drinking coffee so strong and real it almost hurt. The cognitive dissonance was physical, cellular. How could a nation at war, a nation that had supposedly been drained by the conflict, produce this? How could the enemy who had bombed their cities into rubble simultaneously ship such abundance to feed those same cities? An American lieutenant named Sarah Morrison, assigned to the Women's Affairs section of the military government, walked slowly between the tables. She had been briefed on what to expect: hostility, suspicion, perhaps refusal to eat. Instead she saw tears, silence, and something else: confusion so profound it bordered on existential crisis. One woman, perhaps 50 years old, her hair gray and thin, looked up at Lieutenant Morrison and asked in halting English, "Why? Why you feed us like this?" Morrison had been instructed to give a specific answer, one crafted by psychological operations specialists in Frankfurt. Because in a democracy, even former enemies deserve to eat. Because we believe in humanity first, politics second. The question would be repeated hundreds of times across dozens of re-education camps that spring. Why? The answer became a cornerstone of American re-education policy. Films were shown documenting American agricultural production. Mile after mile of wheat fields in the Midwest, vast herds of cattle on western ranches, factory farms producing eggs by the millions. These were not propaganda films in the traditional sense. They were documentary footage, unembellished images of American plenty. Watching them, German women saw the material foundation of the abundance they tasted each morning. They saw mechanical harvesters cutting grain faster than 100 men with scythes, saw refrigerated rail cars transporting food across distances larger than Germany itself, saw assembly lines packaging goods with industrial efficiency that made their own war production seem medieval by comparison. But the films also showed something more subtle, something that penetrated deeper than statistics. They showed American families eating dinner together, tables laden with food, children drinking milk from tall glasses, parents serving second helpings without calculation or rationing. They showed grocery stores with shelves stocked floor to ceiling, shoppers selecting produce with casual abundance, checkout clerks bagging purchases without asking for ration stamps. This was not just material wealth, it was a different relationship with scarcity itself. In Germany, rationing had defined daily existence. Every meal required calculation, every purchase demanded coupons, every table reflected the mathematics of shortage. The American films suggested a world where such calculations were unnecessary, where abundance was simply the baseline condition of existence. Ilse Werner, a former nurse who had spent 4 years treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals, described her reaction to these films in an oral history recorded in 1978. "I had believed we were poor because of the war, because of the blockade, because our enemies wanted to destroy us. But watching those films, I understood something different. They were not rich because they had won. They had won because they were rich. The abundance came first. The victory followed. Everything I had been taught was backwards." This realization, that German poverty was not a condition imposed by war but revealed by war, rippled through the re-education camps like a slow earthquake. The Nazi narrative had positioned Germany as a besieged fortress, surrounded by enemies, forced to sacrifice for survival. But if America could simultaneously fight a two-front war against Germany and Japan while maintaining civilian abundance at home, if they could feed their armies lavishly while also shipping surplus food to feed defeated enemies, then Germany had never been besieged by scarcity. Germany had been poor because it was inefficient, because its economic system prioritized armament over agriculture, because its ideology valued martial discipline over productive prosperity. The dining hall became a daily confrontation with this truth. Each morning, the women returned to the long tables. Each morning, they were served portions that would have fed a German family for days. And each morning, the psychological weight of this abundance pressed harder against the ideology they had internalized. Some resisted fiercely. In a camp near Stuttgart, a woman named Margret Schultz refused to eat for 3 days, insisting the food was a trick, that the Americans were fattening them like livestock before some unspecified punishment. When finally persuaded to eat, she wept with rage, threw her tray against the wall, and screamed, "You are making us weak. You are destroying our discipline." She was not punished. An American psychiatrist met with her daily for 2 weeks, discussing the relationship between scarcity and political control, between hunger and obedience. Dr. Edward Mason, a Harvard psychologist attached to the occupation government, wrote extensively about what he termed alimentary dissonance, the psychological distress caused when deeply held beliefs about scarcity collide with experienced abundance. In a 1947 paper published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, he noted, "The Nazi regime maintained power partly through the management of scarcity. Rationing, sacrifice, and controlled distribution created a population psychologically conditioned to accept centralized authority as the sole guarantor of survival. By introducing abundance without requiring ideological conformity, by feeding without demanding loyalty, we disrupted this fundamental equation. The women in our re-education programs did not convert to democracy through lectures or films. They converted through breakfast." The symbolic power of food extended beyond the dining halls. In Rheinhausen, as in other camps, women were eventually allowed to take small packages home to their families. These packages, a few eggs, a small tin of beef, real coffee beans, became tangible evidence of American abundance that spread through neighborhoods like Sami's. Literature. Children who had never tasted chocolate received Hershey bars. Husbands who had believed American prosperity was propaganda ate Spam sandwiches on white bread. The packages were small, carefully rationed to prevent black market resale, but their psychological impact was immeasurable. Here was proof, held in hand, tasted on the tongue, that the American plenty was real. Letters from the camps circulated among families, passed from sister to cousin to neighbor. Greta Hoffmann's letters to Hamburg were read aloud to groups of women who gathered in bombed-out apartments to hear about the dining halls where food appeared without limit. One letter, dated March 3, 1946, described a scene that became emblematic. "Today they served us cake. Not ration cake made from potato flour and sweetened with saccharin. Real cake with butter and sugar and eggs. Yellow cake with chocolate frosting. They cut it into slices, and each of us received a piece on a small plate with a fork." The American woman supervising the meal said it was someone's birthday, one of the soldiers who worked in the kitchen, and they had made extra so we could celebrate too. Celebrate. As if we were guests at a party, not defeated enemies sitting in an occupation camp. I ate the cake slowly, making it last, and I thought, this is what they had while we were starving. This is what they can give away casually, for a birthday, to people who were trying to kill them a year ago. The cake became a recurring symbol in testimonies from that period. More than the eggs or bacon or bread, the cake represented surplus, the production of food beyond necessity, the transformation of calories into art and celebration. Cake required not just food but excess food, not just survival but abundance sufficient to create pleasure. In Nazi ideology, such excess was decadent, a sign of moral weakness. But the women eating cake in occupation dining halls confronted a troubling alternative. Perhaps abundance itself was a form of strength, perhaps a society that could produce cake for everyone, including its former enemies, was more powerful than one that glorified scarcity and sacrifice. By April 1946, the psychological impact of the feeding program was being documented by American social scientists embedded in the occupation. Surveys showed that women who participated in re-education camps with dining programs demonstrated significantly higher receptiveness to democratic ideals compared to those in programs without robust food service. More strikingly, they were more likely to critically examine Nazi ideology, more willing to accept German responsibility for atrocities, more open to the concept of individual rights over collective duty. The correlation was clear. Feeding the body opened the mind. But the transformation was not simple or linear. Many women experienced profound guilt. They ate American food while their husbands, fathers, and brothers remained in POW camps on reduced rations. They tasted abundance while millions of displaced persons across Europe still starved. Some internalized this guilt as confirmation of Nazi ideology, that they were being corrupted by decadence, softened by luxury, prepared for spiritual defeat. Others processed the guilt differently, seeing it as evidence that Nazi leadership had failed them by pursuing a war Germany could never win, by rejecting alliances that might have prevented such total collapse, by building an economy of scarcity when prosperity was possible. Anneliese Rothman, a former Hitler Youth leader from Cologne, underwent what her supervising officer described as a complete ideological inversion. In May 1946, she wrote an essay as part of her re-education curriculum titled The Lie of Sacrifice. She wrote, "We were taught that hardship made us strong, that suffering was noble, that sacrifice was the highest virtue. But I see now that sacrifice was not our strength, it was our cage. The Americans did not win because they sacrificed more. They won because they didn't have to. They won because their system produced so much that sacrifice was unnecessary. We called them weak for their abundance. But we were weak from our scarcity. Strength is not enduring hunger. Strength is building a society where no one goes hungry." This essay circulated among re-education staff as an example of successful ideological transformation. But it also illustrated something more complex. The women were not simply abandoning Nazi beliefs for American ones. They were constructing entirely new frameworks, synthesizing their experiences of German collapse with their experiences of American abundance, trying to make sense of a world that had revealed itself to be fundamentally different from what they had been taught. The dining halls continued operating through 1946 and into 1947, gradually transitioning from direct American service to German administration under American oversight. The goal was to create a model that Germans could eventually replicate: communal kitchens, efficient distribution, meals as social gathering points rather than private calculations of scarcity. Some camps started teaching nutrition and food preparation, training women to cook for institutions, schools, hospitals. The focus shifted from simply feeding to teaching how to maintain abundance, how to organize systems of supply and distribution, how to think about food as a right rather than a privilege earned through obedience. By late 1947, as the Marshall Plan began flooding Western Europe with economic aid, the character of the dining halls changed again. Food remained abundant, but now discussions during meals focused on reconstruction, on the practical work of building democratic institutions. The symbolism of the dining table, people from different backgrounds sitting together, eating the same food, discussing ideas without fear, was deliberately cultivated. American advisors encouraged debate, even welcomed criticism of American policy, demonstrating that democracy meant tolerating dissent, not punishing it. But the memory of those early meals, of that first overwhelming encounter with abundance, remains central to the transformation. In interviews conducted decades later, women who had passed through the re-education camps returned repeatedly to the dining halls. Not to the lectures on democracy, not to the films about concentration camps, not to the discussions of German guilt. They remembered the food. They remembered the impossibility of eggs piled high, of butter served without weighing, of coffee that smelled like coffee, of bread that tasted like bread. They remembered crying, not from sadness but from the collapse of a worldview, from the sudden understanding that everything they had endured, the hunger, the rationing, the sacrifice, had been unnecessary, that another way of organizing society was possible, that scarcity itself was a political choice, not an inevitability. Greta Hoffmann's final letter to her sister, dated December 1947, shortly before the camp closed and she returned to teaching in Duisburg, contained a reflection that captured this transformation. For 12 years, we were taught that we were special, that our suffering made us superior, that our enemies were weak because they did not know hardship. We wore our hunger like a badge of honor. But now I understand that our hunger was not a badge, it was a chain. The Americans did not defeat us by starving us further. They defeated us by feeding us. They showed us that a society can be strong and generous, powerful and abundant. They showed us that we did not lose because we lacked courage or discipline. We lost because we built a system that produced scarcity and called it virtue. I am still German. I still love my country. But I will never again believe that suffering is noble or that abundance is weakness. The dining hall taught me more about democracy than any book could. It taught me that freedom begins with enough to eat. The dining halls of the re-education camps closed gradually as Germany stabilized, as local food production recovered, as the Marshall Plan transformed Western Europe's economy. But their legacy persisted in unexpected ways. Many women who passed through the camps became teachers, administrators, social workers in the new Federal Republic of Germany. They carried with them the memory of those meals, the experience of abundance shared without condition, the understanding that a society's strength could be measured not by its capacity to endure scarcity but by its ability to create plenty. In the schools they taught, in the institutions they helped build, in the values they passed to the next generation, the lesson of the dining halls echoed. Democracy was not just a system of government, it was a system of distribution, a way of organizing society so that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, so that eating well was a common right rather than a privilege reserved for the obedient. The irony was profound and intentional. The Nazi regime had used food as a tool of control, rationing as a means of maintaining discipline, hunger as a weapon to ensure compliance. The Allied occupation, and particularly the Americans, inverted this entirely. They used abundance as a tool of liberation, generosity as a means of demonstrating possibility, satiation as proof that authoritarianism was unnecessary. They bet that a full stomach would open a closed mind, that the taste of butter would be more persuasive than any lecture, that the experience of eating without fear of scarcity would plant seeds of democratic thought more effectively than any propaganda. And they were right. Not universally, not immediately, not without resistance and complication. But in the ruins of Germany, in converted warehouses that had once produced weapons of war, women sat at long tables and ate food that never seemed to end. They ate and wept and slowly, bite by bite, meal by meal, began to imagine a different Germany. Not the Germany of martial glory and noble sacrifice, not the Germany of Lebensraum and racial destiny, but a Germany that might someday feed its own people as generously as the conquerors now fed the conquered. A Germany where breakfast was not a calculation but a celebration, where children grew tall on milk and meat, where prosperity was the foundation of politics rather than an impossible dream reserved for the victorious. The dining halls are gone now, the warehouses demolished or repurposed, the American soldiers who served eggs and bacon long returned home or buried in the earth they once occupied. But the memory persists, passed down through families, recorded in letters and memoirs, studied by historians trying to understand how nations transform, how ideologies shift, how minds change. And at the center of that transformation sits something simple and profound. A tray of food, eggs and bacon and bread and butter, coffee steaming in a ceramic cup, all of it served with casual abundance to women who had been taught that such plenty was impossible, that scarcity was fate, that sacrifice was destiny. They learned otherwise. They learned that food could be more than sustenance. It could be a message, a promise, a glimpse of a different future. They learned that democracy might taste like real coffee on a cold February morning, like butter melting into warm bread, like cake served at a birthday celebration in the middle of winter. They learned that their hunger had been a lie, that their suffering had been a choice made by leaders who valued power over prosperity, conquest over compassion. They learned that the food never had to end, that the fields of Kansas and the ranches of Texas could feed not just America but the world, that abundance was not a fixed resource to be fought over but a capacity to be built, cultivated, shared. And so, in the end, the dining halls of the re-education camps became classrooms in disguise, teaching lessons about freedom and possibility through the simple act of a shared meal. They taught that democracy was not abstract, not merely a structure of governance or a set of legal principles, but something tangible and nourishing, something that could be tasted and swallowed and digested. They taught that the opposite of totalitarianism was not just political freedom but material security, that the antidote to fascism was not just resistance but abundance, that the path to peace was paved not with treaties alone but with bread, butter, eggs, and the radical promise that everyone, even yesterday's enemy, deserved enough to eat. This was the lesson of the dining halls. This was the message written in scrambled eggs and bacon, in white bread and real coffee, in cakes served on small plates with steel forks. This was how democracy defeated ideology, not through superior rhetoric but through undeniable plenty, not through force of argument but through the irrefutable logic of a meal that never ended.